and welcome to CYOTOPIA, and this is episode 2, where we're going to be where we talk about. No, start over.
Ready? I'll help you out. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Take 467.
Hello, and welcome to CYOTOPIA. This is our YouTube series, and I'm Laura Lam, and this is Dr. Sinead Collins, and we talk to you about creating 2 separate versions of 2050, where we hit net zero emissions for climate change, but one is more equitable, and one is much less equitable.
Yes. So today's hot topic is migration, which I find the scariest topic about climate change. So by 2050, the projection is that there will be 200 million migrants. This is about 10 times higher than current levels of migration. And to put that in perspective, 200 million people means that 1 in 45 people will be displaced. So
that is huge.
That is a huge number of people. And it means those who can choose will have to decide. Should I stay or should I go? Dun, 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 dun. So when we have a higher budget, you won't have to listen to us sing. We'll actually bring in the Clash.
Yes.
But for now, you get us.
Yeah.
So if they don't have a choice, they're either going to be trapped or displaced. And if you do have a choice, then you can migrate or stay. Now, Laura and I are both super lucky, right? We came to the UK willingly as misguided youths. Both of us had a lot of agency in that decision. We didn't have to come here. We chose to. And being paid to move because you're a sought after hot academic is completely different than running away because your home has flooded.
Yes.
So today we're going to explore both those options.
Exactly. And it's worth looking backwards as well before we look forward. So obviously a huge example or obvious example is the Dust Bowl. So in the 1930s, the US had loads of drought, and that turned the middle of the country into very dry and brittle places, which was bad because that's where we grow a lot of our crops. So there were dust storms, lots of crops failed, and it just wasn't great for a lot of people and triggered the Great Depression.
I love how the Great Depression just wasn't great, as opposed to actively sucked.
Yeah, it wasn't great. And so this meant that 2.5 million people left the Dust Bowl states, and that resulted in 2 million homeless people migrating across the country. And my grandfather was one of them. He rode the rails. Oh no, great-grandfather. And so as a percentage of the population, this is like 1.35 million people in the UK, which is more than the entirety of Glasgow. So just imagine Glasgow having to up and move because they can't stay there anymore. And in the 30s, locals thought that these newcomers were going to spread disease and crime.
That sounds eerily familiar.
There were also a rise of shanty towns, discrimination, and poor wages.
Again.
Yep. And then 400,000 people from Oklahoma settled in California, which resulted in the term Okie. So again, discrimination and being derogatory towards migrants is sadly nothing new with humanity.
Almost like history repeats itself.
Yeah.
So we like to think that things like this are far in the past. So the Great Depression, which wasn't so great, according to Laura, was almost 100 years ago. And carrot and stick that we're making are not 100 years in the future, they are a mere 30 years in the future. But climate change migration has already begun. A lot of the migrants we're seeing going to the US from South America, for example, are doing so because crops in their respective homelands, such as Guatemala, are failing. And the New York Times reported on this last year. On more global scale, you can consider that about 1% of the world, which is not that much, is right now this unlivable hot zone really close to the equator. However, by 2070, which is only just like the teeniest little bit beyond carrot and stick that we're projecting here, this unlivable hot zone could be almost 19% of the planet, which is a huge proportion of land. So we've linked to a study down below wherein you can terrify yourself by looking at a case study that makes links between climate change, crop yields, and Mexico-US cross-border migration. So that like pretty much encapsulates all the political fun you can have with climate change migration at once.
Yeah.
Yet more eerie foreshadowing. Subsistence farming near the equator will have much more crop failure. So more cases of malnourishment, and we're going to talk about nourishment in our next episode, which is the food episode. And food is our favorite thing. So looking forward to that episode.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to have snacks while we're recording that one. So next we're going to look at what drivers influence migration. And instead of kind of thinking of it as a whole, we thought we would make it more personal. So we have created 2 hypothetical migrants who have very different backgrounds and needs and requirements, and see how they would move through carrot and stick. So first up, we have Janet. So meet Janet. She is a cocoa farmer in Uganda, and she's trying to decide whether or not to leave home. And Sinead is very fond of Ugandan chocolate and makes it herself as a hobby, which is great because sometimes she gives me chocolate.
Everyone needs a hobby.
Yeah. So when the crops are good, she's able to sell her surplus and then use that to buy food and other goods that is not cocoa. But over the past few years, her yields are down or her crops have failed entirely. And this is, again, a big challenge for her. She is also a single mother wanting to look after her daughter. Next, we have Brad. So Brad is a tech worker in California who works on renewable energy. And every year, the fires that go through Southern California or all throughout California are just getting closer and closer to his home. And he's not super keen on this, as well as having to wear a mask when the smoke is really bad. We're going to assume COVID is no longer a thing in 2050, I hope. And so he also is straight, married, white, and cisgender. So he's quite a privileged guy. And both Janet and Brad are thinking about moving to Edinburgh in either carrot or stick. But there are a lot of factors they have to consider as they decide what to do. And they'll each have different barriers for staying or going, or levels of help that they're able to access. So how many resources can they individually leverage to have agency over their own lives?
So let's start with stick, just so we can end on a high note by finishing with carrot. And let's think about how Brad and Janet would make decisions about migrating to Ed and stick, for example. So in the world of stick, overall migration hasn't been really well prepared for. So certain countries are overwhelmed, and it means things are pretty chaotic and not super well organized, right? So in stick, Janet isn't able to keep her farm running, which I'm really quite sad about. And look after her child. So she uses all of her savings to get her family here. But there's not a lot of support for her once she arrives. And she ends up having to live in less than safe housing. And her employment options are also precarious, despite the fact that she's actually got a lot of knowledge and a lot of skills about agriculture. But in stick, these skills go to waste, and she ends up working as a cleaner in a fancy apartment complex. And we've seen this play out over and over, where really qualified people move across the world and are put to work cleaning houses or driving taxis, rather than actually using the skills that they're bringing to their new home.
Yeah, and those are still important jobs, but we may as well leverage the skills of the migrants if they're coming to that country. And then in stick, Brad has been poached by a Chinese-based tech company for their offices in Edinburgh. So he's paid to move. He doesn't have to shell out of pocket at all. And he's put up in excellent housing, which we'll show you when we go to Ed and Stick's visual. And he's in a gated community and really only interacts with the other international rich. He's very well paid. And Janet works in his building, but he doesn't really interact with her. He works super long hours, rarely sees anyone, and isn't very motivated in his job. So he's
safe from fires.
He is safe from fires. His kids go to a very expensive international school, probably. So he's still very privileged, but his life still has some downsides. So now we're going to show you the visual of Ed and Stick in general. And so in this, economic disparities are greater, there's loads of systemic bias, and that keeps migrants like Janet from improving their lives.
So how would this be different if Brad and Janet went to Carrotborough? Or would they go at all? So actually, in Carrot World, Janet's been able to access drought-resistant crops and join a cooperative that has access to on-demand irrigation during emergencies. So despite having fewer good crop years, she's still able to have sufficient yields and surplus during those years to save and provide for her child. So she ends up actually working with an international seed exchange program, and she helps to test crops. She gains expertise and becomes a partner in this program. So Janet's daughter does eventually move to Edinburgh for university on a scholarship to study agriculture. And Janet does come to Edinburgh, but she does so to visit her daughter and give a guest lecture at the university. So as you can see, just having the agency allowed Janet to not migrate and to stay in her community and to build a much better life for herself.
And then Brad is still poached by a company, but it's owned locally instead of abroad this time. And he has support, but doesn't end up moving into a gated community. He decides to help run their international internship program, which helps swap skills for renewable energy. And this means he's interacting with people from various intersections in a way he just kind of didn't in Edinstick. And his experience hasn't super radically changed, but he now has more control and innovation in his job. He's more motivated, feels more connected to this community, and he's not as overworked. And so because he has free time on the weekends, we've decided he plays gigs at the local pub in a retro new wave band.
Groovy, baby!
And he's actually quite great on the guitar.
Surprisingly competent. So
yeah, so they're obviously both having different experiences because in Carrot, society has prepared for migration and provided other options. Yay!
It's a win-win-win situation, right? So there are partnerships between countries that need to have net emigration and net immigration. That might mean that fewer people migrate, and some of them can return home with tools to help their country or help their community, much like Janet's daughter. So it's not that the climate is that much better in Carrot. It's that Carrot is working with it to build partnerships between communities.
Mm-hmm. So overall, migration and climate change is going to change society. There is just no way around it. And this is a human rights issue just as much as it's climate change. And those are always intertwined. And, in this episode, we haven't even considered things like war, as people might end up fighting for resources. So that means that these numbers that we've thrown out could end up going up even more than 1 in 45, which is quite terrifying. And many of the migrants are obviously going to be people of color because they're based closer to the equator. And that means that entrenched racism and past colonialism are also going to result in slower action unless we start acting now and make a concerted effort.
And we can start acting now. The most effective thing you could do as an individual who's worried about climate change and many of the things that will come along with it is to write to your NP. Start a conversation about climate change. Let them know that you care and that you vote. Let us start with Carrot.
Let's start hopeful. All right, so here is Alex's beautiful art, and the first thing you notice is that he has extended out into Leith Harbor, which gives us kind of a more zoomed out view of the city. And obviously we have huge boats that are arriving, fast boats. There's a kraken that has migrated as well into the water. And the thing that struck us overall is just how much more open and accessible and welcoming this version of the future is.
So when people get off whatever fast boat they arrive on, they come to this amazing welcome gate, and it puts them directly into the city. And the city is a really open and welcoming place, actually, because you see that there's this beautiful harbor with trees planted in it, and people are outside doing all sorts of things, mainly skateboarding. So rest assured the hipsters totally make it to 2050. But there's also people playing with cats and outside talking to each other. There's some sort of market going on under Northbridge. There are gyms, design shops, outdoor markets. And if you look carefully, you can see some grassroots stuff going on. There's a music and art sign. There's a jazz sign. So when people arrive at the city, if they plan to stay, they can go to the Immigration Welcome Center, which is at the center of the city. And it's also in the same building as the World Agricultural Conference, which is being held, and Darth Vader is now loitering outside of that. I don't know if it's because he's lost his conference ID, is my guess.
Or they wouldn't let him back in for crimes against the galaxy. Who knows? But yeah, and you can see that there's still the stuff that we built on episode 1. There's still the big community farm in the center of things. You've got the charged little cars, still loads of people on the bike lanes, and we still have that shelter to protect people from the elements, but it's really just added to and expanded upon. And yeah, you just have a sense that this is a welcoming place to be and where you would actually want to spend time.
People are doing stuff and making things and generally enjoying their city. And tiny spoiler for future episodes, you can also see that there's a lot of energy generation happening within the city. So we can see use of both wind and solar power now popping up on some of the building tops. And so we encourage you to find that. You can also find Brad and Janet in Carrot.
Yeah, which is quite fun. So eventually it's going to be like a Where's Waldo kind of thing.
I think they call him Wally in the UK.
Oh yeah, well, we call him Waldo.
We
claim him as Waldo.
So definitely Carrot looks like a lot of fun despite the weather.
Yeah.
In stark and horrible contrast.
Yes. And now we come to Stick, which clearly has a less welcoming harbor. It looks like it's just sort of degrading into the sea, and the buildings are crumbling as before. And there is no welcoming center. There is instead a giant border control with riot police and just no, as people are pretty much corralled into a prison until they can decide whether or not they are allowed to enter the city. Though at least they get to play some basketball. So there's that.
Well, 2 of them get to play basketball.
Yeah.
And those riot police are not just at border control. You see there they are deployed en masse in front of crap stuff and cheap things where there's a protest going on. So the people of Stick are unhappy with their lot in life. And as you can see in Stick, even though people live there and there is infrastructure and that there are buildings, people aren't really using the city to do anything fun. Most people in Stick are just surviving. They're outside the job center, or they're outside the food bank where they need to show ID. And a few people are living in sort of gated communities.
And the protest is probably not legal, and that kind of sadly harkens back to now, where there's just been a bill that's passed to discourage protesting. So that's kind of a natural follow-on. And yeah, there's no sense of culture really. You don't get any pointing to music or art. And yeah, it just all looks a little bit grim.
So let's not. I think the main thing that I wanted to think about with Carrot and Stick was just that we spent the migration episode talking about the decisions people make to migrate and what we can do to facilitate it. But we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the consequences of that, which is that when you have quite an open idea of how the world should be, and you view people coming in as contributors rather than invaders, then there's the potential to build something really quite beautiful in terms of art and culture and science, and food. Oh my goodness, the food, which is
all the food.
Talk about next episode.
Yeah, so I think in this it really shows the difference between surviving as they are in Stick and thriving as they are in Carrot. And that's not to say things in Carrot will be perfect necessarily, but it looks like it is a much kinder place to live right about now.
Yeah, well, they still have the clouds.
Yep.
Do appear much happier. So, as always, we encourage you to add your own comments about what Carrot and Stick would look like in your part of the world. We encourage you to find all sorts of little stuff that Alex has hidden in these pictures for you, including Brad and Janet. And we encourage you to give us ideas for what we should put in the food episodes.
Yes, and we always want to know, what do you think your corner of the world would look like? And yeah, just give us your thoughts. And we look forward to seeing you next time on CYOTOPIA. So thank you for watching CYOTOPIA, and please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the bell, because again, evidently that's important. This has been Choose Your Own Topia.
And Choose Better World, peeps. Should I say that again?
Yeah, sure.
All right, here we go. La 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 la. Choose a better world, peeps.